you. Thanks for tuning into the Waiting List podcast. I'm Long Long.
I'm Daniel.
And I'm Jacqueline. And we are three watch friends with a healthy obsession for watches.
So sit back and relax with us while we chat with collectors, industry giants, and share some good vibes.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to yet another episode. I am joined by Daniel and Long Long, and we are in for a special treat today because we have here with us a collector I certainly look to when I want to discuss things over or just have a second opinion on. Someone whose eye for detail, I think, is incredibly skilled and honed, and his collecting philosophy seasoned. For the sake of this podcast, we'll call him D, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on this podcast. Believe it or not, this is I've never done a podcast before. I don't think so. We'll see how this goes, but I'm very excited, but very nervous at the same time. But once again, I think I'm really excited. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah,
I thought you were going to say it's a dream come true. Actually, I thought that was the line you were going to come up with. But
it is the dream come true, but I have to take it easy. You know, I gotta slowly build up to it.
Yeah.
Goals, life goals. Come on.
I have to say, so I've been following your account. I mean, you know this because I told you before. I've been following your account since I started mine, and I've been kind of just admiring it from afar. And then I reached out to you earlier last year, and then we kind of, hit it off and chatted really well. So I also wanted to say thank you for making it relatively easy and not too hard when I invited you on the podcast. I thought, it didn't take too much convincing when I heard that you've never done one before. So thank you for making it easy for me.
I would say that is such a long-winded way of saying you lurked the guy, and when you messaged out, he didn't tell you to F off.
Well, when I started okay, sure. But when I followed him, I wasn't even on this podcast. So yeah.
Wow, long time lurk.
Yeah.
Long term.
No, when I started my account. So like in 2020. Yeah. Okay. So for those of you who know this collector, you can find him on Instagram at Dubulu, which is, am I saying it right? Like, is that how you're supposed to say it?
It's however your heart tells you.
It's DOOBOOLOO. Okay. And for those who just hearing his name for the first time, his IG name, we'll start off with a brief introduction. So first question, D, please briefly introduce yourself, where you are from, grew up, career background, and how you got into watches.
Sure. I'm originally from Korea. Born in Korea, and spent about, I guess, 10 or so years of my earlier part of my life in Korea. And then our family, we moved to Beijing in 1992. My dad was sent from his sort of a company to the branch over in Beijing to sort of kickstart the operations. Shortly after the sort of trade barriers had been lifted between, China and many of the other sort of neighboring countries. So we're kind of sort of one of the early sort of group of foreigners to sort of go in there and experience sort of the growth of China from the early 90s onto sort of what it is now. I remember the first few years, I mean, there were still donkey carts running around in the large streets of Beijing, and many of the streets didn't even have street lamps. And, I think, there weren't that many tall buildings. It was very different. I remember going on the weekends to shop for, groceries, and I'd be, mud-lined, streets with, wooden shacks, selling vegetables and other produce. And it was a very different time, obviously. Back in the early 90s, but wow! Just to be able to have witnessed that growth has been, I think, a huge honor for me to have seen that sort of partly in person. But anyway, so I spent sort of the second half of my childhood in China, and split 50-50 between Beijing and Guangzhou, and then I came to the U.S. for college and ended up staying here since then. Landed my first job in New York City in finance. And I'm still doing what I started doing back then, about what is it now, like 16 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And how did you get into watches?
So that's an interesting question. It was a bit of a frightening thing for me. I'll just go back to sort of my educational background, I guess. I think is a kind of a relevant place to start. And I actually started as a mechanical engineer, and engineering has always been sort of at the heart of how I think, and sort of surround myself with the things I love and so forth. So, but life has a way of sort of finding its own way, and ended up in finance and whatnot. So I've always been interested in sort of these micro mechanical objects for a long time, but I didn't have the money. I didn't come from a background where sort of these luxury goods were a part of life, so to say. And so I was really afraid, I'll be honest, for a long time. Even when my sort of pay started getting to a point where I could pay off my student loans and start finally looking at sort of some things that I thought would be were sort of out of reach in terms of affordability. For many years I consciously sort of stayed away from it. I kind of treated them like drugs.
Mm-hmm.
It's like like how like a naive teenager would look at like cocaine and sort of like, oh, that's scary. That's scary stuff. I gotta stay away. I'm sure it's pretty good, but I gotta stay away, right? So and then one day I just I kind of broke down. I said I'm just too curious. I gotta figure this out. So I went into a boutique and bought a watch, and the rest is history, right? Once you sort of break that first, you're only version once, right? So once you sort of break that first barrier, it's it. But I feel like it was very natural for me, just always having had that mechanical sort of engineering mindset, understanding watches and sort of appreciating watches from the inside out. It just sort of became very natural to me. And having the community like around Purist Pro, and so forth, and later sort of finding Instagram and the local collector community here in New York, it's been really wonderful to learn.
Yeah, Daniel.
I have a question straight off, which is interestingly, you spent time in Korea, then China, and now in the US, right? Which actual culture do you resonate with the most, and where do you feel most comfortable? That's my first question.
That's an interesting question. My wife is Korean. She's we're both fresh off the sorry. Apple isn't really oh, it's cooked up to be. My AirPod just fell out. But so my wife is a Korean, and we're both reasonably fresh off the boats. So culturally speaking, I think the baseline is still very much Korean. We speak Korean at home. We're teaching our kids Korean before we teach them English. But at the same time, from a cultural perspective, there's a very there are elements of Chinese culture that resonate very strongly within me, right? Yeah. Not to mention food. That's a the culinary aspect. I'm definitely I'm like at least 60%. Especially having after having spent time in Guangzhou, it's a game changer. So.
Well, you think the culinary aspect? You're 60% Chinese.
No, I'm just saying. I just I wouldn't. I think that's not a bad. Because here's the thing. You have to understand. Korea is a tiny little country that has, throughout its history, right? It's never really experienced the levels of prosperity or grandness as China has in the past. And I mean this not in a bad sense, and not in a negative sense towards Korea at all. I just mean in that just naturally speaking, it's always been sort of a smaller neighbor to China, right? So natural resources are limited. That's the big thing. So Korean cuisine, Korean culture, we had to make do with fewer things that were available to us. Yes, we had the three sides surrounded by oceans and seafood, it was plentiful and so forth. But on land, so like a lot of the Korean cuisines are sort of derivatives of like the same types of materials, just cooked different ways, so to say, right? Whereas in China, you've got this giant landmass of like this like an East Asian melting pot of different cultures and different regions coming together with different sort of, and there's so and it's the varying degrees of raw materials that are available for the sort of the palettes of Chinese cuisine is it's you can't compare, right? So it's just a different level, I think. Once again, I'm not making like what's better or worse sort of a comparison, but it's just very different, right? Korean cuisine is very much of a vertical depth, I would say, whereas there's a lot of horizontal breadth in Chinese cuisine, and I think that's fascinating because like a lot of the really amazing Chinese foods are, you know, you present the raw material, you present the ingredient in a minimally altered manner, right? Like, you know, fish, for example. And I think you don't really have that in Korea, I think.
I love soy marinated crab.
Oh yeah.
But I have a second question leading on from that as well. I was hoping like you could shed some light on just what the differences between like that culture. There are similarities between Korean parents and Chinese parents, because you know a lot of people will say like Chinese tiger mums, right? But you know when I was at school, you know the Koreans were pretty at the top of like, let's say, maths and stuff, right? And it was pretty well known like in the Asian community that even amongst Orientals, the Koreans are like so militant on pushing their kids right to the top. You know, their schedules are crazy, you know, really strict, more so than I would actually say, you know, my impression was that it was Korean and then Japanese and then Chinese and then Hong Kongers. But, you know, where's that mindset come from?
You know, I think it's a very post-war mentality combined with sort of, you know, once again, kind of alluding to, you know, going back to what I talked about in terms of cuisines. I mean, Korea always having sort of been surrounded by other stronger nations throughout most of its history. There's a lot of, and we call this Han in Korean culture. I don't know, I can't remember off the top of my head what it translates to in English directly, but it's a lot of like, you know, feelings of like resentment, loathing, you know, like there's a lot of like this anger that's built in because, you know, we went through so much of oppression. And, you know, even recently throughout the war, it's been, you know, the Korea was devastated and people had to build up from scratch, right? So people say Korea was rebuilt, modern Korea was rebuilt on soju because that was the only thing that men, when they went out to rebuild what was essentially ruins and rubbles, that was the only thing that could comfort them at night when they, you know, returned home. And I think there's an element of that. They're like, people are so sick and tired of losing and getting beat down that it, you know, there's almost like it's almost baked into our DNA, I feel, in many ways. And there might be an element of that. I mean, if over so many generations and so many centuries, right? If an entire sort of group of, you know, homogenous peoples have been sort of, you know, been essentially have, there's a bit of that survival bias, right? You know, people who are able to survive through these sort of oppression and wars and whatnot are, I mean, there, you know, there may be something, I mean, there might be something there. I don't know. I'm making very broad assumptions and broad strokes. And, you know, obviously these are just, you know, just very general theories out there. But I think definitely there is a bit of that. And you see that changing, right? I mean, because this current generation, I think our generation included, we haven't seen that. We haven't seen Korean ruins. We haven't seen like people getting massacred. You know, we haven't seen that with our own. We've heard about it. We've read about it, right? We've all read about these painful, you know, parts of history. But we, you know, most of us and our sort of the next generation have mostly seen, you know, the general affluence, right? And optimism, positivity. So I think there's a big shift in sort of how sort of people sort of perceive themselves and how they want to sort of, I guess, pass it along to the next generation. And I think it's less of like, you know, success at all costs, I think, which was sort of the mindset of the previous generations to pull them out of poverty, right? And you know, whatever it takes, even if it means that the children are going to hate me, as long as they succeed and do well and, you know, and pull themselves out of poverty, I've done my job. If that was the previous generation's mindset, I think now it's a lot more sort of, I guess, aligned with many of the other nations that sort of were in the stage. Like, you know, I would think that, once again, you know, perhaps you could sort of bring in some of your experience from as a, you know, as a Hong Kong, native, sort of, perhaps because Hong Kong has always been sort of the bright spot in Asia, right? For a long
I don't
time.
know.
I mean, in the
I
recent
actually
history anyway.
I actually thought Hong Kong, copied the Japanese model. They copied that. Hong Kongers, I think they really embrace Japanese culture generally, right? And they try and adopt a lot of, not necessarily a lot other main like China culture or Korean culture, back when I was a kid. But it sounds like what you're saying is that the generations in Korea were a lot closer to severe poverty, as because you're talking about like as the generations, as you get more generations, you get further away from severe poverty and more affluent. You also lose that maybe that fighting like spirit.
Yeah, you don't need to. Like, nobody really needs to work that hard to have a decent life.
Yeah,
anymore.
exactly.
Which,
Yeah,
you have better social
Yeah.
safety net. Everybody's just
exactly.
a culture where, as a social group, it's just everybody's just better off, right? And I think civilizations go through these cycles, right? At some point, you can reach a point where everybody's so, it's so well built up that you kind of hit a peak and then sort of it starts deteriorating from there, right? And we've seen that over and over in throughout history, I feel. But not that that's imminent anytime soon, but I mean, people just get other priorities, right? It's just not about material success.
Well, the mindset changes because you already have the country's already developed, so the focus on developing the country, having the bare essentials, well, it can't be the focus anymore because you have it, right? So you have to keep progressing, and that's how you become a more developed country.
And it's interesting. It kind of links back to watch collecting in many ways, and Jacqueline and I discussed this in our last call, and it's interesting because maybe one of the reasons why I'm so excited about watches is because I never had this chance before in sort of my life until recently, right? So I've been sort of in this impoverished state when it comes to sort of collecting. Whereas if I once again, this is all just speculation, but if I was born into a family and a culture where sort of collecting of watches and other arts and whatnot was a bit more of a common occurrence, maybe it wouldn't be so special to me, because it was just always around it. I would have other priorities that would excite me. So it's just, once again, I think everything is relative, and it's an interesting point.
I have a quick follow-up question. While we're on the topic of identity and background, I was just curious, do you see any patterns around the Asian collectors community while you were going through your collecting journey? Because from my like mere understanding, there are some communities online that, again, I haven't really met many people, but I was just curious, do you belong to any smaller like groups of communities like that, or do you think it's just like a big salad bowl, like a lot of different ethnicities and backgrounds?
I think it's certainly a bit of a salad bowl, but what I have noticed, I think, and once again, there are so many more seasoned collectors out there that have been collecting for far longer than I could imagine. So I'm only drawing from sort of my contemporary history of the past, say, 10 years, right, of collecting. I think if I've seen a bit of a change, I think let's say about up to about 5 years, 7 years ago, maybe perhaps. I think Asia. Asian collectors have always been sort of a force in the watch world, right? And I think, and one way the Asian collector community, and a lot coming from Singapore and Japan, with some from Hong Kong, I think they were the sort of the first to really embrace avant-garde sort of horology. I mean, sort of exemplified by the likes of MB&F. I think they were sort of the first to sort of soak it in and really embrace it and drive, and once again, as much as I don't like talking about market values. I mean, those were some of the local peaks and some of the valuations driven by Asian demand for many of these MBNF pieces, for example, right? I think if you listen to the stories of many of these independents and sort of, especially some of these avant-garde independents, Asia was always sort of that very, very important market. Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, especially. I mean, Korea is really up and coming, I feel, but the other three sort of regions were certainly big players in that market, and we've sort of seen that tail off a little bit, right, of late, I feel. But now we're certainly seeing a huge sort of resurgence of demand from the young Asian collectors. Large sort of I think portion coming from mainland China, but Hong Kong, Tokyo, and even Korea is now joining the fray as well. But it seems to me there's this new wave of collectors. That's for sure. I think I think all of us are kind of part of it too, right? One could argue we're reasonably young still.
Thank you.
But I mean, certainly, I mean, but we're talking like, I mean, we're seeing, some, certain new wealth in, the teenagers, sort of, the early 20s, sort of, come into the market, and I think I've had conversations where it's a real force to be reckoned with, and the priorities are slightly different, obviously. There, I'm not going to make a judgment call as to sort of, any one priority in watch collecting is more important than the other, because that's a silly thing to discuss, because we're talking about watch collecting. None of this is any, essential to human life, right? This, at the end of the day, we're just all talking about little trinkets on the wrist, that happen to tell time, and not any better than like an iPhone, right, or any other quartz watch for that matter. So just not to take ourselves too seriously, but it's interesting, but certainly, but the fact that they are able to drive this hype, I think, says a lot. And in conjunction with sort of all this NFT movement that's happening, and it feels very seamless. That whole community of young collectors, the way they mobilize, the way they disseminate information, sort of the way they sort of gather together online, and sort of through these platforms, it's really fascinating to see. So it feels like a bit of a change of guards, but but certainly there's a new sort of it seems to me that there's a new force in town, comprised of these young Asian collectors.
So you brought it up briefly, and it's actually like a question later on I wanted to ask, but since we're on this topic, how do you make sense of the current market, or do you think it doesn't make sense?
It's a very interesting question, right? The market's the market. That's I think one thing as a person that has to live in the financial markets, day in and day out, one thing that the rule number one is you always have to respect the market, right? The market's always bigger than you, right? Regardless of what I think about the market, whether I like it or not, that's the market. Unfortunately, if pieces exchange hands at this price repeatedly, I mean, who am I to argue that's the wrong price, right? That is the right price. That is absolutely the right price, and clearly there. It doesn't even matter if it's driven by money laundering. Like that's irrelevant. The fact that a market has taken hold, and that's where pieces regularly exchange hands, and that's that enough said, right? That we got to respect that. Do I like it? No, not one bit. I think it's brought about a number of interesting sort of side effects that make collecting less fun than before, but that's a very personal opinion of mine. Yeah, I mean, it's got to respect the market. That's what it is. But what I do know is that there is a large constituency out there who see this new wave of collectors coming in. In other words, the collector base is not a steady state, right? So there's a huge constituency that are convinced of this market being the new normal, so to say, and it's here to stay. I'd like to cautiously think that there could be shift in sort of sentiments or tastes, and a shift in sort of one hot thing to the next and so forth. And I think those changes will happen over the next few years. And we've all seen it, even in recent history with, sort of, for example, Daytonas and the Paul Newmans and so forth. What looked like an invincible sector clearly turned out to be more transient than, I think many of the experts had given it credit for. So, we'll see. I think what I can certainly say is that when I have conversation with other collectors, there's certainly a bit of fatigue setting in, right? And I think people are looking for sort of that feeling that they got, at least for those who sort of got in early enough to ever had that opportunity to have that feeling, of course, that, that feeling that they're sort of, this collecting, this watch that they buy is sort of helping define their character, for example, right? What does it mean to buy a hype watch? Like, does that really help you define one's character? Does it really help you to sort of continue to cultivate your character as you wish, right? And what does it accomplish in your collection as sort of, part of your story? I mean, is it just a financial asset? I mean, you call up people and many of the dealers are now talking like watches are a legitimate financial sort of asset class. And, I mean, maybe that's what it's become. Maybe it's just become an asset class and that's it, right? But it's certainly interesting because what appears to be a more significant herd mentality is sort of looming over this market and many of the collectors out there. I think it opens up a lot of very, very interesting doors if you just dig a little bit deeper, right? Many of the sectors are just completely ignored. You look at auctions and sometimes like stuff that are, very interesting, just nobody even bids on because, there are some other lots, 2-3 lots, before and after that are far more interesting, and people are just not paying attention, right? Even dealers who usually would take shots on some of the interesting pieces that, at these prices just seem to be blinded by, what they can sort of move and make money on. So, which I think, look, it's just a different type of fun. I would argue, actually, because of this market and because of all the hype that's surrounding the market, it's actually become more satisfying to find something that is not, to use a very strange term, infected with the hype, right? It's harder to do so. Therefore, it's more satisfying when you find something that fits that category. I mean, of course, it can't just be anything that just falls outside the hype, right? Most hype pieces tend to be hyped up because they're good, right? They have some fundamental value to them, right? That's why they're hyped in the first place. It's not like it's just hyped because they're, just for no reason. So obviously, some of the obvious values are, obvious pieces with obvious, positive redeeming values are sort of taken out of the market. But still, it's you realize, wristwatches have been around for well over a century, right? And there's a lot to choose from, turns out. And so I'm sort of in a phase where I'm really rediscovering many of the vintage landscapes and finding that there's a lot of fun to be had still. And there were times when vintage was king, right? I mean, now we're talking about Nautilus and Royal Oaks and all these modern independents, and those are sort of the driving forces in hype. But this wasn't always the case. So maybe we're seeing some of this sort of cyclical thing coming back where, who knows, I mean, maybe people will sort of go nuts over pocket watches as soon as some celebrities start, rocking them, in a fashionable way. Who knows, right? It'll be interesting to see. I mean, that's
waiting for Long to do that.
Again?
Waiting for Long to do that. To get the pocket
right,
watch.
Exactly right.
What you need to do is we need to hedge like the market and actually stock up before she does that. As soon as she posts it with a leg shot or something, it's done. That market's done. Like, then we can offload.
All right. Speaking of pocket watches, this is not a question. I just wanted to bring it up. You recently acquired, or is it a recent acquisition, the Breguet pocket watch?
Yes.
That was restored by Michel Parmigiani. It's absolutely gorgeous. And I think you posted like, again, I'm like stalking you as per what Daniel said, but like I think you posted like once, and it was kind of, you're trying out this like new monochrome thing. It's like half hidden with the black light. Would be cool to finally see it, in broad light and see the dial and the guilloche. So we're just waiting for that post.
That pocket watch experience has been so wonderful.
It's insane.
The watch is insane. I mean, that's I agree, and thank you. And I think the watch has a lot of merit by itself. But I've been talking about this watch with my collector friends for a long time. The series of these, Parmigiani designed and created Breguet pocket watches. And I got close to purchasing, several times, some of the variants in the series. And yeah, I mean, we've been talking. And once again, this is, you gotta imagine, I think this is over probably the past like 4 to 5 years worth of a time frame, right? We're not talking like, 3 months ago, right?
Mm.
And this piece comes up that I've never seen before. I've never seen the world timer version before. Only, once again, it goes to show how of a novice I am and an amateur of a collector I am, compared to sort of many of these seasoned great collectors that have seen the market for decades of existence, and have this encyclopedia knowledge of what has transpired. So I the day I post that watch, I am connected, once again, people that I've never spoken to on Instagram, with people who that once again like offered up unsolicited all this treasure trove of knowledge of the history of these pieces. And I'm pointed to specific auctions from they're not even in the search database. If you go to like Christie and Sotheby's, you can't even search for these things because they're too old, right? But the websites are still there, and like Google searches won't reveal them, but you just got to know where to find it, right? So which date, which what Geneva, like this month, this auction in Geneva and so forth in Hong Kong. And if you can find it, but otherwise it's impossible to search for, and voila. So like the fact that the watch sort of links together, sort of brings together sort of the previous 5 years of this search for the right piece with many of the collectors, and sort of afterwards it connected me with new people, right? And sort of new pieces of information that followed, and now the watch stands on its own. But what happened, sort of everything else that surrounded the watch, both before and after, and sort of all this knowledge accumulated before and after, I think that's essentially what I think is so cool about this watch. And once again, it kind of brings home the point that it's really all about the people, that are the amazing people that are in this hobby together. And I think it's just one of those beautiful moments where
yeah, I just really concur with what you're saying, because like you mentioned about hype pieces, you mentioned the fatigue around those hype pieces, and the fact that when you got this piece, it opened up a new channel of what probably a well-respected collector, that to have access to that, to have the validation from them, is actually maybe more stimulating than the other stuff that is on the market. So a lot of maybe, and I'm speculating here, people that have been in the collecting watches for a period of time, I would say 10 years is pretty lengthy, are now looking for pieces that are actually not known, aesthetically beautiful, great condition, but are not known, just to keep differentiating themselves out from a particular herd mentality that follows hype pieces. And that might be even why the interest in independent brands is so high as well, because obviously you've got the herd mentality, which is then segmenting off to independence, which then further segments off to very unknown vintage pieces and references.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what, since you brought up independence, I again, it's not I'm kissing your ass here, but I mean it is true. Like, you just need to go and scroll through your account, right?
Yeah.
You really were like kind of, I mean, amongst other collectors, I think you were being very humble there. Even though you've been collecting for only a decade as compared to, you know, other people maybe like 20, 30, 40 years, but you got into independence like right from the start, if would you say? And like, I mean, again, stalker mode, and we talked about this, you've single-handed like owned probably some of the most important FP joints out there. And you've owned a DeFore, Grunenfeld, Roger Smith, all the Karis, the first Observatoire, right? Like, what was it like and what attracted you to these independents back then when it was still kind of like a niche following as compared to now when it's kind of like blown out of proportions?
I'd like to make a correction first. I said a decade. That was a very rounded number. It's just I don't want people listening to this, you know, podcast down the line to think that I've actually been collecting for 10 years. No, it's actually shorter than that. So
okay.
just I don't want to be, you know, out there
So you're even more amazing, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
In a shorter amount of time. Okay, we got it.
No, I just, you know, that's far from it. But you know, I'll tell you a crazy story. I really wanted to buy more watches, right? So the first watch I bought was a Panerai because I was walking down the street with my wife, and literally we're just like bored, and I'm just, you know, we just happened to be passing by the Panerai boutique on Fifth Avenue, or was it Madison at the time? And Madison Avenue, right? And I'm like, let's just go in and check something out. And they had the 42 millimeter titanium radio mirror, and I was like, I've always been fascinated by the Panerai sort of aesthetic. And I was like, well, this is not so crazy, right? It's small. And I'm like, okay, well, yeah, I'll just buy it. I just literally just spent like half an hour in the boutique and left with it because I felt like I had to start somewhere. I didn't know anything at the time. And all I knew was that I happened to sort of know Panerai and like their aesthetic and, you know, got drawn to it. And so I ended up buying it. I couldn't sleep for like 5 days, 5 nights. I felt so guilty. I had this, you know, block of weight on my chest every time I went to bed. I was sweating bullets. Like literally, I'd wake up in a pool of sweat, not having had any good sleep because I was just.
Panerais are quite big though. Yeah, huh? They can put that pressure on your chest. They are quite.
I mean,
big
it's crazy. I've never spent that kind of money. I've never spent like, what was it, like $7,000, $6,000 on a watch. I mean, I've never spent that kind of money ever on myself on anything. It felt so guilty. It was crazy. And then of course I started to enjoy that feeling a little bit, you know, after a week.
Indirectly, I've never spent all this much money on myself.
I was like, so this is what it feels like, right? I mean, you know, I guess that's what drugs are like. At the first time you try to hit you hard and then start to sort of grow on you, you know. Anyway, so I'm like thinking, you know, oh, that's cool, you know. So I finally got over that first sort of in losing my virginity moment.
And then you went crazy.
My first proper watch, right? And I'm like, now I'm like starting to look. I'm like, okay, well, I'm you know, I'm no longer a saint. So let's see what else, what other damage I can go around, you know, literally this is the thought process. I see a guy at a cafe, you know, I'm hanging out with my wife and I see this dude with a rose gold watch with a black dial and looks stunning, right? I'm like, I don't know what that watch is, but that looks really good. So I'm like trying to look for a watch, and I'm like, well, so what shops are there? And I Google do a Google Maps, and turns out there's this place called FP Journal around my place. I'm like, that's interesting. So let's go check it out. Of course, I do some Google searches, and I really like their watches. Like their whole aesthetic is like crazy. It's like, it seems like super niche. You know, it seems like there's a group of like crazy people, you know, who collect these watches, and I just loved how they look and sort of the uniqueness of the mechanism and so forth. So I walk in, see a black dial, you know, the boutique edition rose gold centigraph on the shelf, and this is of course many years before things started disappearing from shelves. You could just literally walk in, try it, and buy it, right? Yeah. So I walk in and I'm like, oh, this is really nice, right? And because I'm such a newbie, I don't know how like watch negotiation works. You know, I'm like, you know, I've never done that before. I don't want to embarrass myself. So I'm like, I go walk in, And then I walk, I'm like, I really like this. I'm gonna think about it, right? And I come back and I send, we exchange a couple of emails back and forth, and I'm like, okay, I'll take it, right? So yeah, that's how I got into FP Journ, and since then I just got really hooked. What really got me hooked on the brand was one day I was playing around with the Stenograph, and anybody who's played around with the Stenograph will know it's an unusual watch, right? It's got a lot of quirks, and one of the quirks is sort of how the pushers work when you try to reset the watch. It's got a little bit of a step to it. When you try to reset, it first resets one hand, and then when you sort of do a full press, it goes both all the hands sort of reset. And wasn't sure if that was normal. I wasn't sure if this is kind of a defect with the watch. So I stopped. But once again, I lived a few blocks away. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. Finish your story first.
So I walked. So yeah, thanks. I walked by after work. I'm like, hey, I had a question about this watch, that I bought like a few weeks ago. And they're like, oh, you just want to hang around for like 15 more minutes? FP's gonna be here. I'm like, what? what do you mean? So I'm like hanging out, and Francois Paul shows up, and I'm like, my jaw's like on the floor. I'm like, what? It's like a celebrity sighting, right?
Mm.
And the dude just sits with me, and he sort of in his sort of broken English sort of tries to explain what's going on, and he plays around with it and tells me about all the clutch mechanism, and this is perfectly normal, and this is fine. That's how it's designed, and so forth. And then a bunch of other collectors show up, and we end up just going to dinner together.
Wow.
And I invited my wife, and I went back home, got properly dressed, and came back, and it was a bit of a scramble, but that left a big impression on me. It was like, wow, this dude that runs this brand is a real person, and he I've never seen him before. He doesn't know me, but he literally just walked into the boutique because he was scheduled for this dinner, and decided to sit down with me and explain this watch to me. And we had a great time together over dinner, and I made a lot of great friends then. Friends that I would consider at that dinner. The people I met then were are still sort of one of my closest sort of watch buddies here in New York City. Generally speaking, the FP Journ crew tends to be that way, I feel. And I just felt really blown away. I mean, you don't see any other watch brand where the dude with the name on the watch just shows up and says hello and tells me about sort of his creation, right? That just doesn't happen, and that really left a big impression on me. And sort of that's when I started to sort of dig deeper into Journs.
I'm gonna say one thing before Lung cuts in.
Yeah.
Well, he explained to you in English, right, about the watch, like in broken English, but there's a myth, right? Like you hear about it all the time. He actually is fluent. You just don't.
I've heard.
And he just he doesn't understand English and only speaks French.
I happen to not, once again, I blame this on my Asianness. I need to be able to take in a lot more alcohol for me to get to that stage out of him. It seems like, where he pulls out his fluent English.
Yeah,
but I have heard that as well. That he is indeed perfectly fluent. Then it's all a show.
Yeah, Lung.
I wanted to ask, from the Panerai at that price range under 10K, and then you suddenly jumped to like Centigraph, so over 10K. Before you walked into the FP Journ boutique, did you Google, like one, Google the prices, and two, did you set a budget before going in?
I did actually. So I knew exactly how much it cost, or the range of sort of prices. That was sort of, I was like, that was, so that was my budget. And I didn't really have a watch budget, so to say. I mean, there were many years where, once again, you have to understand that, financially, I've always sort of never, been in a situation where I could really spend and, keep spending without, limits, right? So, I mean, there were years when I first started collecting FP Journs, I literally would run out of money by October, because I just like went nuts with like spending too much money on watches. And I'm like, holy crap, I gotta sell some stuff to
eat pot noodles,
like pay rent. like my wife didn't know about it, but I was looking at my wife, I was like, this is not comfortable at all. Like I remember I missed one year. I miscalculated my bonus timing, and literally for a month, I was like, I couldn't go to sleep because I knew like this was like I'm cutting way too close. So I mean, it's I mean, I just when you say budget, yes, I had the illusion of a budget, but sometimes it went a little overboard with my limited finances at the time, and still, I'm not, it's yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking like if the Panerai took you a week to get over that heavy weight on your chest, how long did the FPJ take? Is that months?
No, actually, like I said, once you, the first time you lose your virginity, I think, that's the only time that matters, right? So it honestly, it would just didn't feel that, it felt great. I mean, I loved the watch. It just, and I loved wearing it. I just remember, I went, went to bed fine, like slept like a baby, it was
Every
fine.
time you say the virginity thing, I think of literally like you waited for this perfect girl and then you lost your virginity, and then suddenly your mind's awakened to girls, and you're like, wow.
It's a pretty apt description, I think. And as first
Very
love,
apt, very true as well.
I'm just saying, it's just
Okay, I have a quick question, which I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about FP Jordans, and again, you've owned a lot of like really incredible modern FP Jordans, right? But what was the attraction to you also own like other independents? So what is it about independent brands that attracts you? Is it their philosophy? Is there their like carefreeness, relatively speaking? Such as Kari and others. Like what do you look for when you want to acquire a watch?
That's a tough question because what I looked for in the past versus what I look for now are very different. And even in the past, when I went through these phases of independence, I would say that at first, when I started collecting FP Journs and was heavily sort of, only an FP Journ collector, I think I wanted to be like, I found a niche market. And I want to sort of be the master of it, right? And I think being a niche player had a lot of allure to me. Being that guy with that oddball watch that nobody knows about, right? Other than like a small select group of people that similar geeks, so to say. I think that part really appealed to me. I mean, in other words, I guess I set a really high bar for why do I buy stupid expensive pieces of trinkets on the wrist. It can't be because, oh yeah, I want to like, do a wrist flick at the bar. That really could not be my reason. It had to be the farthest reason away from that, which is once again, like, had to be a niche watch that nobody knew what it was, for all they care. It's a, $200 watch at Macy's, right? That's gold plated. But only those who know would know, right? And that was very important to me. And then I started to get into movements and movement finishing. And this is, I was very fortunate sort of to be friends with the Hodinkee team and, ended up, kind of having that opportunity to shoot and do the article for the HE and Dufour and Laurent Ferrier comparison on Hodinkee. And soon thereafter, I ended up with all three. With the Laurent Ferrier and the Simplicity anyway, not the HE for myself, but around that time, like movement, I became that movement snob, so to say. So that was like a hugely important factor for me. And I think getting into Kari at a deeper level was sort of driven by sort of his reputation for movement finishing. And then I sort of grew out of that phase after sort of going through, I guess, the Simplicity, which is, I guess, many people consider to be sort of the Mount Everest of movement finishing. But once you get there, you realize it's just a mountain at the end of the day, right? It's not, it's not the big picture. So I started to sort of pivot away from, looking at sort of movements as the holy grail and being a movement snob. And I think there was a bit of that snobbery, like, oh, if you don't know movements, like, you really don't know watches, right? I mean, yeah, and I realized that really was a very narrow-minded view of looking at the scene. And I really started to fall into sort of like, I guess, watches as art on the wrist, sculptural forms. This is about the time I bought my Opus 5. So that kind of shows you sort of, which direction that's going. Now independents have, and as you mentioned, I think Dan, you mentioned this earlier, independents have become the hype sector now, right? I mean, in many ways. I'm really happy for them because now, I mean, back in the day, independents would be struggling and financially, and it's just it wasn't easy to be an independent watchmaker. Many failed. Many couldn't even like get off couldn't get the first series sold. Very tough. Now you launch a brand and immediately you're sold out, right? It's I mean, so if you ask me the question, what am I looking for now in independence? I think it's no different than what I look for in any other watch now. I think that's the honest answer. Which is, I think ultimately right now I'm in this sort of a design above all phase, I would say. And not just something from a sculptural perspective. I think the independents were able to sort of execute with the highest level, with the highest sort of the utmost attention to detail in terms of the design elements. I think really get my attention here in the market. There are many great independents, but I think that really sort of is it for me.
Yeah. Something you mentioned earlier, which was about like, you didn't really want to have, you want to have the oddball watch, right? And now, it's pretty hard, but is actually production number a key factor? Because, production number kind of signifies really how truly rare something is per year, right? So Roger Smith, super rare. I see that, you have one. That kind of almost gives you reassurance that you're probably going to be at some place and you're the only one that's going to have that piece. And then my second question, which is not related, is having all this experience with the independent brands and being a movement snob at a point of your collecting journey, where would you rank the top finishing, like with the independents? How would you, like, let's say, for example, the top 3, would you say?
Oh, that's that's a very difficult question because I think people do different things. Like some brands would do certain aspects very well. Some brands would do certain aspects very well. I think there's a reason why, Simplicity continually ranks sort of high up there. But obviously, that series was not without faults, I would say. There were some issues with sort of different serial number ranges having varying degrees of finish versus some other serial number ranges. But it had some really, great qualities to it. I mean, especially those the broader, rounded anglage with the inner angles, just, once again, just out there. It's easy to do good finishing nowadays, right? I mean, the production processes and the precision CNC machining, you cut out so much of the prep work before you get to that point where you can just polish out the angles and call it a day and just carve out the inner angles and say you've got X number of inner angles. So the baseline has been raised across the board. So everybody can say they've got great finishing. They've got all these inner angles and all these sort of polished bevels and nice Geneva striping and all that jazz. But they're reasonably standardized. So like for Dufour's work, I think still stands out amongst this sort of higher waterline of what's out there. I mean, Acrivia's recent work, his latest, V2, especially if you look at sort of how broad that sort of, anglage is and sort of how rounded and how just well executed that is to the highest degree. I think, they are continuing to set new sort of bars in terms of, how can you take hand finishing to the next step, right? So I think Akrivia probably takes the top spot here, if you were to ask me, in terms of sort of, because I feel like if you just do it like how people did it in the past, but do it well, I don't think that really is enough to make number one. And I think out of all the sort of things and pieces that I've seen, probably Akrivia sort of is up there in terms of, wow, they really found another way to take hand finishing to the next level, sort of a thing. Otherwise, like what are we really looking for, right? Once again, the quality of striping is interesting. You could have something that looks really even and smooth, but somehow doesn't produce an emotional response.
Mm-hmm.
But also you could have something that looks a little bit rough on the edges, but maybe technically it's a little bit less perfect, but it evokes such a warm feeling when you look at it. And I don't know, I mean, how do you judge that? Right? Well, how do you rank that one versus the other?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
I mean, like, for example, when by chance, when I was in Geneva last year, I ran into a winner, who, showed me his piece. And I mean, I wasn't expecting it. It's hard to tell from press photos and whatnot, right? It's especially on these micro brands where there just isn't much material going around. But I mean, I was just shocked by the quality of the striping. I mean, there are a lot of other great qualities of the watch too. The dial, the case, the angle, the balance wheel, construction and all that jazz. It's a marvelous piece. But I mean, it was a long time. It was one of those moments where, like, wow, kind of you get slapped in the face, like, wow, I had forgotten that you could achieve such a dramatic effect from just Geneva striping if it's done to such a high degree, and because otherwise the response would be, oh, it's so boring, it's the entire movement's covered in one giant, like 7/8 plate, right? And it's just got striping over it, or some frosted finish over it, and that's kind of a boring movement, people could say, but not necessarily. It's a really refreshing. It was rather refreshing for me to see what could have been very boring turned into something very exciting just from that sort of finishing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, otherwise, I mean, those two are the ones that really stand out in my mind right now as sort of the two that kind of left the mark recently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would definitely say those two brands, the way they finish, actually very dramatic. There's a lot of flair in that finishing, while something like Akari Voutilainen, equally, well finished to some degree, but it's a different language almost.
Very different language, right.
Yeah, and it's that appreciation of, if we're talking about movements, a lot of people will just go straight up and say Dufour and Kari, and like not and say, Dufour and Recepi, and then say, Kari's kind of dropped off a bit, right? And they might put that down to, do you know what his production number is? He's increasing production, he's getting sidetracked with doing dials with Grenefeld and Schwartz Etienne and Urban Jensen, how much is he actually involved with it? But he is actually Scandinavian and Finnish as well, right? And he has a very different interpretation of what finishing will be on certain pieces, right?
And that wasn't it. I mean, I don't think the utmost in finishing was ever his goal anyway. Like his, maybe it's his Scandinavian pragmatism kind of coming into play, but he was always very, if he's experimenting with chronometry, not with improving his finish. No doubt, as you said, his pieces are finished to a very high degree, but in all honesty, that level of finishing is no longer considered to be unique, sort of in class sort of finishing, because now everybody's doing finishing to such a high degree, right?
Mm-hmm.
So relatively speaking, it loses its edge a little bit. It used to be considered top of the line, but now it's probably like, kind of middle of the pack, right? But really, the amount of effort he focuses on sort of improving the performance of his watches, making sure that they're reliable over the long term, making sure the bridges are thick and solid and doesn't transmit like unnecessary vibrations or torsional flex of some of these, pieces that are going in, and, developing sort of new complications and so forth. I mean, he's spending a lot more time with those rather than sort of what's been fascinating with Instagram is all these, look, the Swiss watchmaking industry, I guess watchmaking industry in general is a pretty is a sweatshop industry, right? I mean, there are houses like Grubel Forsey and whatnot that pride in sort of doing a lot of the things in house, but even they outsource a lot of this finishing to external parties, right? I mean, there are finishing specialist shops out there. So really, what does finishing mean anyway if it's all finished by third party, quote unquote sweatshops? If it's not, unless it's really one dude that sits down and does it from start to finish, which is very rare nowadays anyway. Like, whose finishing is it, right? Can a brand really take credit for a finishing that is done by a house that happens to also finish like a dozen other highly well finished brands, right? That's not
what a can of worms you've just opened.
I mean, it can of worms it. I mean, like it, but but that's the truth, though. I mean, I'm not sure if a lot of the collectors out there are under the impression that if you buy something from this, independent brand X, that it's somehow, it's just only those employees in their workshop sort of doing things from, start to end. No, that's never.
What do you mean? That's what the photos show.
That's what the photos show. But I mean, but that's the truth, right?
The old guy with the overalls, is it not? Like, you don't see any machines. I saw a furnace the other day in one of these programs.
Right. They're smelting the iron.
Yeah, smelting. I saw the smelting thing.
Specifically for that caliber.
I saw hammers there. Right? Hammers that not precision tools, hammers that like even themselves are 100 years old.
Right. Passed down through the generations of time in the mountains of Switzerland. But that's the truth, though. I mean, these are, it's a team effort, for lack of a better word. And how can you rank finishing if it's once again done by, once again, there are houses, let's, caveat is, yes, there are still places that do this all in house and so forth, but not all independents can, they're at a stage where can do that, right? I mean, it's they have to build a brand, they have to build a product that is functional, operational, reliable, and they have to sell it. And I think that's where it stands right now.
I want to move forward and talk about your last trip to Geneva, where you were invited as a jury member for the Grand Prix. Can you tell us a little bit how that experience was like for you? Because I know, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but when we were doing the intro call, you were kind of like, I'm a very private person, but then they showed like a photo of me and now I'm kind of out there, but then I think it's worth it because it was really enjoyable. So can you tell us a little bit more about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, it was a landmark experience for me because I've never been to Geneva before in my life. It was my first trip to Geneva to I've seen pictures, I've heard, stories about Geneva and all that. And I've never done like a watch excursion, outside of, just once again, because, it's just work and family. It's been impossible to sort of, find my own time. But, getting this GPHG jury invitation really gave me a great excuse where I could convince my wife, hey, this is an opportunity of a lifetime. I really got to do this, right? I'm going to take a week off and leave the 2 kids behind with you. But this is not about me. The honor of the family, and so
honor the family. Wow, you really pushed the boat out there.
I mean, that's you gotta defend the honor of the family. That's very important, right? That's you can't underestimate that honor. But yeah, so I was able to sort of get a very hard-fought exception to the rule and be able to sort of travel for a week to watch things with watch bros and watch ladies. And it was I mean, look, it was wonderful, and it cemented once again in me that it's all about the people. I mean, the people that I've known online, I've finally gotten to meet in person, and they're just as wonderful, if not more wonderful in person than they were virtually. I've reconnected with many old friends who, we've met before pre-COVID in the city when they were in New York City, and reconnected there. Many of my heroes, watchmaking heroes, we were able to sort of just kind of run into each other, on the streets and say hello. And I mean, just really what an amazing place, right? For during that amazing time. The jury experience was fascinating because it brought, sort of regular novice collectors like myself, people from all different types of, from walks of life. They were not just insiders, industry insiders or, super veterans, in the watchmaking world. So and I think they were really making a push for that, right? They were really trying to turn the jury into a more of an open, democratic, kind of a diverse, set of opinions. And I think it worked. It was really fascinating. It was wonderful to see, artists, people in the fashion industry, alongside, just regular collectors, and watchmaking executives and watchmakers themselves and so forth, in the room. So I mean, look, the decisions were hard, partly because there weren't that many choices to choose from, but that's unfortunately not not anybody's fault. But yeah, once again, it's all about the people. Yeah, Long Yu.
Yeah.
I want to know if you had imposter syndrome, like you felt like you weren't worthy of being there, or were you like, I have to be here?
Hey, it's all about the
Like,
honor.
I should be here.
It's all about the honor, I mean, it's not. I'm not doing it for myself. What does it matter then?
So self-sacrificial.
It's also, I mean, I
Yeah, I definitely feel
my
the sacrifice.
ego was checked in Jersey before I left for the airport. No, but I think that's a good question. It's people are. I was worried about that. I was really worried. Like, I mean, who am I? I'm just some dude, lives in Jersey with 2 little kids, and I just happen to be collecting watches. And why the heck? I actually thought the email was a spam, like some sort of a scam mail. When I first got it, I'm like, this can't be true. Like, so I started asking people around, like, did you get this email? And nobody else got it. So clearly, it's scam, right? I mean, that's definitely a scam. It's so I didn't respond for like weeks because I thought I was certainly a scam. But turns out it wasn't. So I'm glad I responded at the end. Yeah, I mean, I certainly was. Before I got there, like before I went into that room, I was scared. I thought, I was like, man, this is gonna be so out of my league. I'm gonna be so, like, who am I, right? Like, who am I to even say a word in this?
I'm gonna be shown up. Yeah.
I mean, look, JC Beaver was on the jury list. Although he didn't make it, like, he had the honorable title of being a collector too. I'm like, look, you have JC Beaver as a collector and this dude as another collector. I mean, like, you can't. That's not that's not the same thing. So there was a lot of pressure, but I think, but people are so down to earth, and it was really warm and inviting, and I think people really just, once again, it's just wonderful people.
I would like echo that. Probably people still don't know, but like Long and I have never met Jacqueline on this call, and that's somebody, I really, really, really think, what you said. We have such a great chemistry online. Like, to meet her in real person over food would just be like, just absolutely the highlight of the year. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
I love making her go red. Like she's
Jack
gonna be like,
feel like she's worthy of meeting us.
No,
Yeah.
because my next follow-up question to D was like, did you meet anyone that was just a total ass?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to know too.
That's what you wanted to.
Yeah. There must be some douchebags.
No, but
Like,
I
they
think
can't
you
all be
girls are
nice.
more likely to get that, because you get dudes trying to have the extra thing to impress you as well. Like, dudes and dudes is a bit different.
Yeah, and we all know Europe's way more liberal on that front than, so I mean, it's interesting. I think, I mean,
You don't
no,
have to answer that.
no, I mean, the truth is no. I'm just trying to think of an example where that was discussed, but I mean,
Yeah.
not really. I mean,
It's because you didn't meet me there.
ah.
You already know that, Daniel. What an ass.
No, but I mean, it's yeah, that's a good question. But I mean, well, there was one strange incident. We're hanging out at at the Leopard Room across the street from the hotel, where it turns out like that's like the only place where anybody hangs out in Geneva. It turns out, as I learned. And there was this lurker who was sitting in one corner in the cigar room, and like very interesting, shady character, but like started to like, came up to our group and started asking questions. He was clearly like somebody who knew a lot of things, but pretended like he wasn't, and like it was like semi combative in, and then he kept showing up like day after, like every day. Clearly he was like an insider of some sort because he was like hanging out with all these other people too. But it was weird. Like we all kind of looked at each other in the eye and we're like, this guy's like, there's something odd going on here with this dude. But other than, I mean, well, he
Sounds like
wasn't
our
really an
mutual
asshole,
friend.
say, but it was say again?
Sounds like a mutual friend of ours.
It must have been.
Yeah.
But yeah, strange occurrence. But other than that, everybody was very pleasant. I think also because everybody had been so deprived of human contact for so long due to COVID, and this was like everybody just felt so relieved to, be able to see people. I think people really, even those who had the general propensity to be an ass, probably were nice people. I think that probably had a role in it.
And okay, I have two last questions, which is, during the pre-call, you mentioned something that I thought was really funny. You said you don't have a particularly good memory, but you do use watches as anchors to remember things and remember trips. So during when you went to the Geneva, you were able to pick up a watch that you've been waiting for 5 years, was it? And then you did make some trips to pick up watches. What was like the most memorable one, and why do you think to you watches are those memorable like anchors?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I forgot your question.
So do you remember
I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. I'm making a self-derogatory comment on my memory.
That was such a watch nerd joke.
Sorry, I had to. I apologize.
That's good.
But it's true. I really have horrible memory. I mean, I have trouble with faces, names, especially, and I sometimes I forget entire events altogether, like without a trace of it ever having happened, and people are like, you were there, you had this particular colored shirt on, and we did this, and I'm like, what are you talking about? So I do use watches as an anchor for a lot of my memories, and I take out a watch and put it on my wrist, and I all of a sudden remember all the places I've been to, with that watch on. And it's really nice. Like I wouldn't remember, my kids being born if it wasn't for the watch I'd been wearing at the time, So
that's a statement.
I wonder what your wife thinks about that.
I sold that watch, so that memory's not going to last for long.
Yeah, we have to delete that whole honor part and this whole part about like, I remember my kids, but it was like, what? Right, you're not going on any trip.
But look, I think the one that probably takes the cake for me is probably the trip I took to pick up a watch. This was my, during my sort of early days when I was a deep diehard, Jorn fanatic. And I really wanted a Tokyo Resonance for a long time. And when I say a long time, I mean like 6 months, because I've only known Jorn for like, the watch for like a year. So, but it felt like eternity, right? I'm like, why can't I buy this? Well, why isn't this available? Like, yeah, obviously, because there are only so many made. But those were the days when like crazy rare Jordans would just pop up and nobody wanted them. They'd sit on dealer inventory for like months before somebody would get a huge discount on it and be forced to take it at crazy levels. It's so I'm like waiting for like a Tokyo, like a titanium resonance to pop up, and I'm in a business trip in Las Vegas, and big dinner, I'm stuffed, I'm like totally drunk, and it's like I come back to the hotel, I've got a like 6 a.m. flight out the next morning. and I'm like toast. But of course, before I go to bed, I'm checking my Chrono 24 search for Jorns, and voila, something had popped up in Japan. So it's like close to midnight. I'm dead tired. I'm half drunk, and I've only got a few hours of sleep. But I'm like, I gotta call these guys up, you know. And
Please do the accent. Please.
Yeah,
Do the accent.
I mean, you know, it's like I call Tokyo, and they're like, "Moshi moshi," you know. I'm like, okay, hello, and they're like, sumimasen. They hang up. And I'm like, what's going on over there? I'm sure they heard me. So I call again, and I'm like, hello, and they're and sort of and they sort of like put me on hold, and somebody that sort of speaks a little bit of English comes, you know, and you know, picks up the phone and says, oh, so sorry, we know ship outside Japan, and he's about to hang up, and I'm like, no, don't hang up on me, don't hang up, please, just hear me out, right? So I spend a good part of probably like 15-20 minutes trying to convince them in, you know, mutually broken English at that time to let me pay for the watch sight unseen so that I could go pick it up later in you know, down the line. Because essentially I think you know, there must have been some export like complications to sending like a watch out of Japan, or whether it's insurance related. I don't know what it was, but it seems like that was, in retrospect, you know, that seems like that was sort of common in Japan, where, you know, you buy a watch and you only have to pick it up in Japan. And ultimately they agree. So I send them my details, and, you know, the next day I sort of wire the sum, and, you know, and I got to figure it out. So I find like a long weekend, and, you know, like a month later, I book my flights, and it literally ends up being like a weekend flight from New York to Tokyo just to go pick up the watch.
Was that another honor trip?
Huh?
Was that another honor trip? You know, trip for the
Oh,
honor,
this was before kids, so it was like, you know, there was less honor required. Yeah, so it was I had a little bit more flex then, you know, and it was just a weekend, so it wasn't a whole week. So
did your wife ask you how come you're flying all the way to Japan?
It was also earlier in my marriage, so, you know, it's I could afford.
It sounds dodgy. I'm going to fly to Japan for a weekend.
Yeah. don't mind me. But yeah, so I landed at the airport with my little carry-on, you know, bag in tow. I hit the dealer and I pick up the watch. Things go smoothly, and I come back to the hotel and I crash. And literally 2-3 days, I spend most of that time jet lagged and taking pictures of my lovely new watch. You know, spending some quality time together in the hotel room. And I fly back, and it's I mean, that was probably the first time I did something so stupid for a watch. And you know, and I'll never forget the whole sort of experience, like every single step of that process. Like, you know, when I first got out, you know, the next day to explore like Ginza by myself, for example, you know, kind of hit all these sort of like, you know, random restaurants, you know, in the free time that I had before catching the next flight out. The pictures I took on the plane, the picture I took at the airport with the watch, you know, sort of, you know, the whole experience of it. I mean, you know, it was such a cool, you know, I mean, that's a story I can tell, right, to my friends about how I did a weekend day trip to Japan just to pick up a watch, right? And then I ended up doing something similar with in Madrid last year. It was last year or the year before. Once again, my memory is very hazy. I think it was last year. I did a quick, you know, 2-day trip to Madrid to pick up a watch as well, and you know, that was a lovely trip. But yeah, I mean, those are probably my top two sort of watch memories. Only because I think the trips themselves were initiated because of a watch, right? But yeah, I mean, trips with, I mean, I could, you know, the list goes on. I mean, it's trips that I would not remember in such vivid detail. I do because, you know, I'm partly because I stopped at so many points throughout the trip to take, you know, wrist shots. Really, that's you know, so I have a lot of these sort of like pause, save, you know, in the games, right? Those moments. But yeah, it's a very important tool for me.
I bet you saw Ginza in a very different light after having quality time in the bedroom with your new Tokyo Edition FP Jean.
Yeah, right? It was yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was you know, it's hard to I mean, you're right. It's I mean, we can't go into too much detail on that front because, you know, this is a public you know, radio station. But, we can take it offline if you.
I love it. I love it. I really love the part where you're like, I have to equally reciprocate in broken English so that the other person understands what I'm saying. And I mean,
is that how
Dan,
it works? I mean, isn't
it
that how
does
works?
work. Like
You
I'm
can't speak-
speaking to this
Yeah,
Italian
you're
dealer,
mimicking. Yeah.
and yeah, and then like I forget the exact detail, but he was like, I make all happy. I make you all happy. I do something. I think solution all happy. I was like, yes, all happy. And then it's just like stupid things. And then he's like, yes, yes, bravo, yes. So that's yeah, it's something that you kind of, you know, have to experience once. Just the desperation to get something right, to get that watch that you're willing to just like use three-year-old language, dumb your entire like education level down to reciprocate for the other person to understand you.
I think it's all
use
very
Google
interesting.
Translate.
Yeah,
I
I think
even
it's
used Google
interesting.
Translate before, where like I
People
type it
really-
and then like play the
Wow.
voiceover to the other like person, and then they speaks Italian, and then do it again like that.
Whatever works, you know, if it works, it works.
Yeah, exactly. What were you gonna say, Dan?
No, I'm just saying, like, for people, like, there's always an impression or a perspective of how luxury watches are transacted, right? And the reality is most of them are not like that. And it's like exactly how, you know, it's a very much of an improvisation, right?
Oh,
Where
absolutely right.
you are trying to get a watch and you're just trying to find like the best means in the shortest time, because you're also wary the watch can go at any
Oh,
time as well.
absolutely. Right.
So you're trying to lock it down as fast as, and the way the mind works, man, it's so productive in that 20 minutes, right?
I mean, like,
You just want to lock it down. You don't want to hang up. Like that hang up thing is so true, because you just think, if I hang up, some other dude's going to call, right?
no, absolutely right. In my mind, my mind's racing, you know, like I gotta be the worst English speaker that's gonna call them so that they can best understand me. Otherwise, they're gonna, you know, go to the other guy that has a, you know, that has even worse broken English that they can understand. You know, I gotta balance all those things out.
Yeah, and you
Yeah.
also think like, oh man, if a dude actually Japanese dude's coming, he's got way
Yeah.
more advantage.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely right. You never.
He's got far
right,
more upside.
Right. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
All
like,
right.
what's that phrase? Shut the hell up, just take my money.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly how I felt. Yeah.
Shut the hell up. Give me the account. Give me the money.
Shut up and take my money. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, last question before we move on to the reversal round, which is your wife is also, you know, has her own account and is an enthusiast in some way. How did that start? How did she catch the bug?
Well, she was I think good question.
Thank you.
She's an artist. And you know, before our training as a fine artist, her sort of a first degree was in fashion design. So I think she always had a sort of an eye for accessories and design and so forth. And you know, I mean, you know, she was the one that wanted, you know, Royal Oaks and Nautiluses even before they got hot. You know, when people, you know, those were like, you know, you could have, you know, buy a 5711 for like, you know, 20 grand from like 10 different shops in New York City, and you know, nobody wanted them. Like, you know what I'm saying? Those were the days, and she, you know, even then she was like, whoa, this design really speaks to me, not knowing anything else about watches. And she you know, wanted one, and you know, so forth. So like she approaches it from a very design sort of centric perspective, you know, way before I sort of opened my eyes to that element of watches. But also I think we really tried hard to find a common hobby together. So it was, I mean, I'm really thankful for her to have sort of essentially accommodated for my craziness, right? By sort of embracing it as her own. And because I don't think it was something that really occurred naturally to her. Like, you know, it's but you know, sort of seeing what I sort of, you know, the levels of craziness that I sort of got into, and I think she sort of really tried hard to sort of understand and get into it herself. And now she's, you know, she's very much into it. But So yeah, I mean, I'm really thankful for that, because she could have just said, screw you and go, you go have, time with your watch buddies, and I'm gonna stay out of it. But yeah, she was very supportive from the early days of, like, when we used to have, watch meets at the Jordan boutiques and whatnot, and so she got to know everybody else and all that jazz. But yeah, she's developed her own language in terms of watch collecting. And yeah, it's I dare I say, she was kind of ahead of, the game before, ever since she started, really. So yeah.
I think it's great. Go follow her at Watchbirder. Okay, so reverse around. Have you thought of the questions for us?
So yeah, I had a question. So what is it like? I guess this is directed to Lung, since you are a much more openly public personality out there, and recently having done the wonderful series with Odinki as well. And how does that impact / influence you as a collector, sort of being a much more of an open personality?
Good question. I don't think it has much effect, actually. And I actually didn't think the Hodinky interview had much of an impact in terms of how I just moving forward from like before the interview and after. I don't think anything changed that much, to be honest. I actually thought that a lot of people would reach out and then maybe change the direction of how I collected. But then ultimately, it still always goes back to like, this is my process usually. I just generally meet the same people. And sometimes those people bring more collectors and we just hang out on the weekends. We smoke cigars, we look at watches. And then during those meets, usually someone wears something new. So then you say, hey, what's that? And I take a picture, I go back and I read about it. And it kind of starts from there. If about a week or like a month later, I forget about that watch, that kind of like cements the fact that that watch probably isn't that special to me anyways. So then I move on to the next thing. But if that watch keeps like coming up in my mind and I keep thinking about it, then I'm like, okay, there's probably something special there. And then I'll go and like re-investigate and then read more about it. And then I'll reach out to people that have the watch. And then I'll start to say, hey, let's meet up. And then it kind of starts from there. But generally now, like for a long time, I've been telling Dan this for I think close to a year now. I feel really like I wouldn't say uninspired, but I have no urge to buy anything, or I haven't seen something that moved me to the point that I'm like, okay, I have to stop everything and look for that watch and get it like right away. So I'm just waiting for that thing to hit me. Well, this is how I feel right now, anyways. Yeah.
But that resonates with me too. I mean, it's getting more and more difficult. I mean, and maybe this is the healthy, steady state, right? I mean, maybe it is healthy that there's no laundry list of watches that you have to absolutely go and hunt down and buy at any given point, and you just wait for things to naturally come to you, right? Both the inception of that idea, as well as the opportunity. So I think that's generally sort of a not a bad thing, but no, thank you for the insight. That's interesting to hear that. That's and I guess related to that question for you, Dan. And let me give you a little bit of a background as to sort of why I'm asking this question. New York is a really a weird place. It's where very stupid rich people have 8-9 figure homes in very fancy parts of Connecticut and so forth. Come down to work, and the culture of there's a strange blue collar sort of humble brag culture of like I'm stupid rich, and I fly helicopters to my cottage residence mansion up in some place in Connecticut by the beach, but while I'm in the office I wear my stupid plastic Casio, and there's a bit of a strange like
is that why you just posted the Casio?
I mean, I have to, I have to stand my, I have to, prove my, I have to, absolutely. That's
Yeah,
a
Pinkasio,
very important part
I
of
love
watch
that.
collecting in New York is to make sure that you have that street cred. But it's true.
That you're
Like,
Playground
relatable, you
cred.
mean? That you're
Playground.
relatable.
well, I mean, but but it's actually very like, so there's nobody at work, maybe outside of one person that I could actually talk about watches or even show my watches, for example. So it's always hidden under the cuffs. I other than the small group of people that I know here, which is once again less than a dozen, I'd say, in New York City, they just don't exist, which is weird because you think New York is like a big like watch slash cultural center. You got all the big
Mecca.
boutiques here. It's like a mecca of sorts, but it's a strange, because like what I've heard is that generally in Asia, the brotherhood, or I guess the sisterhood in the case of Yulong, or like vice versa, mix of brotherhood, sisterhood, and but the general like this camaraderie is what I'm trying to get to, right?
Mhm.
At work and among friends, like there's this sort of like, for lack of a better word, a healthy competition for collecting and so forth, where it's encouraged in many ways to sort of collect together and sort of share together and sort of do this all together with the people that you spend your time with, and it's viewed as perfectly okay to be spending stupid amounts of money on little trinkets on wrists, right? Whereas that's viewed as a big no-no, as like you're spending $2,000 on a watch, are you crazy, right? Even though the dude lives in like a $10 million home up there, right? So it's a, I mean, of course, that's not always true, but I've had a hard time sort of wrestling with that on my end. So I just wanted to get your perspective on how it is like sort of living in Asia and working in Asia and sort of maintaining this sort of camaraderie among among your coworkers, friends, and so forth. Is it a lonely journey? Is it a very, collegial journey? Like, how is it like for you?
It's a very pleasurable journey. It's funny that you say you don't have many people, because like there are so many people that I could link up with and talk about watches that I don't want to link up with them anymore. Right? Like, I just want to stick to still a very core. Watch collecting is a very, solo journey. And at points, you do want to share it with certain people, right? But there's sometimes where you do want to be left alone. And, whoever I meet, I think it's generally pretty comfortable and accepting. But I think what you're referring more to is, a culture's perspective on success, right? Because Chinese people, they regard like someone that's done well, they think, how did you do it? Like, can I learn from this person? I want to get there too. But while, especially when I was in Europe, it was more like, that guy's done something wrong. He's cheated the system, or like, he did something bad. You know what I mean? You're not part of the main herd, which we are normal. We have like, you definitely probably, to get that money, you're probably not very moral, right? Pretty much like how I think, general public see financial people in some way, that kind of same undertone. But in Asia, it isn't like that. It's like, because, there is that prejudgment on people in the finance industry. But in China, people made their wealth in so many different ways. Yeah. Like, how can you judge? And everybody's honestly trying to reach the same goal. In Chinese is, if I get that money, if I get to X amount, I've made it, I'm a success. While in more developed countries, as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, success can mean a number of things. But just in Asia, success seems very closely linked with your basically how much money you have. there's no better way of saying it. So when you do have something like watch collecting, it's seen as like certain milestones within your life. Like a Rolex is certain seen as a milestone. Oh, I've got a Rolex now. And then if you keep going up, not only are you keeping going up in like financial terms, but there's also that essence of status as well, right? So the circles I'm hanging around with, and the next goal just keeps coming up. Oh, Rolex doesn't work, AP, now Patek, then independent, and everything like that. And that in itself is a journey. But as you're going through the journey, you're realizing, especially I would say in Hong Kong, and increasingly actually in China, where you can't just own these pieces just because you've got money. You got to know what you're talking about, right? So you have that side as well. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but generally, yeah, I enjoy meeting people that are into watches. Maybe similar to Long Long with the current situation of the market, I'm a little bit fatigued, not of any of the pieces, but also of the chat about watches. You know, when a lot of the chat inevitably becomes about the hype and money, it's actually like not the reason why I got into watches in the first place, right? So I prefer other conversations such as, you know, movement finishing and things like that. It's things that are actually tangible educational points. Market is very opinion based, right? It's always like, how do you predict the market? How do you see the market? Like all this kind of stuff. It's not really that tangible. And yeah, so yeah. Sorry, that sounded such a crap answer.
No, I think you hit on all the right points. You know, just you know, that's actually very, I think, poignant, you know, perspective in terms of you know, kind of going back to sort of what defines success and, you know, how people perceive it, right? And I think that partly is the reason why there's a healthy amount of sort of, you know, like encouraging each other to sort of, you know, indulge in these material, you know, excesses, so to say, right? Versus here, where that's even in a place like New York, you know, it's a little bit, you know, in many ways, it's discouraged.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, there's something else I want to add just to finish off my answer, and then you can ask the question to Jacqueline, which I spoke to Long Long about this, which is, you know, when you have a community, it's basically a relationship between people, right? And the relationship has to offer some kind of value, like mutual value, beneficial on two parties, right? If after a while, and this sounds really snobby, I meet a lot of collectors and my knowledge level on certain things in the industry or pieces is very extensive, but the opposite collector isn't necessarily at that level. Maybe it's earlier on in that journey. It's not that I'm not willing to give my time. It's I'm only willing to give an X amount of my time to that because they might get a lot of value. They might learn a lot, right? And I appreciate that's how I started, right? But I don't get a lot out of it, right? I don't, what do I get? Like 2 hours, 3 hours of coffee time talking about watches, about probably a conversation I've had about maybe 10 times. Yeah. And I think in some respects, this is what I enjoy about this podcast. I say one thing once and then X amount of people listen to it and I don't have to repeat myself, right? So,
but actually, you bring up a very interesting point. And, you know, I don't want to drag this onto, you know, sort of a whole thing onto its own, but so the most of my closest watch buddies have that mutual respect of, in other words, we always are at the top of our game in terms of what we bring to the table. But that also results in a situation where I just like hanging out with the guy, right? And we end up, you know, two dudes, just, you know, two geeky dudes sitting at a bar or restaurant, just chatting for hours on end. But we might not be talking about, oftentimes we don't even talk about watches at all. You know? And so like, I found it so fascinating that watches are what led us together, right? And that's where our sort of baseline core interests lie. But the people that I think the people sort of that I guess you're filtering for, the people who are willing to sort of spend the time and energy to sort of develop themselves further into the, in other words, people who are not doing it for the superficial reasons, I would say, right? Maybe that's a better way to put it. Also tend to be just very interesting people where I could connect at so many different levels other than just watches. Like unbelievable amounts of like levels where I'm constantly learning, I'm constantly giving sort of useful sort of information and valuable insight to the other party, and we're always connecting with. And so I think it's that's a very interesting point to be able to, you know, I think that's a very useful filter to have, in that people who are able to continually sort of provide you with stimulation, right? You know, could probably, you know, you guys can probably have cross stimulation on, you know, on almost any other topic, you know, outside of watches too.
Yeah, I'm obviously I'm based in Shanghai, but I'm now in Hong Kong doing this interview, so I'm actually flying out next week. But I've spent a lot of time with long this trip, right? And you know, when I say value between relationship, it doesn't necessarily have to be watch knowledge, right? But it's a friendship, right? And that's a relationship in itself. And I don't think we've spoken much about watches. I mean, the point she raised about being fatigued, when you know somebody that well, you feel it. Do you know what I mean? Like, she would have felt the same way as like, you can just feel it and see through how they're talking, right? That they're fatigued. And I think she probably felt the same with me. Like, he must feel the same. But we, like you say, we talk about many, many different things. And I think, in the last 2 years, for example, I'm just going to say, she's been, an integral part of my own self-development, and putting things in my life and systems in place to make me improve. And that's a different type of value, right? But it has to offer some kind of value. If you're just talking about watches and then, what else do you offer, right?
Which is, yep. And I think I just realized that I had my ear stuck with these AirPods all throughout the show, and then I realized it's not even being used. So I'm such an idiot. But like I said, I'm a podcast newbie. What can I say? I thought I was being all fancy with the AirPods. Turns out it wasn't even turned on. I mean, seriously.
You had the look.
I had the look.
With the Casio,
I was in the zone. I was in the zone, man.
And
the in my ears that I felt I was so into it.
With the Casio G-Shock and your hoodie, you're definitely street.
There you go. All I gotta go is buy some NFTs and paste my profile pictures. Monkey Kingdom. Here we go. Right. Okay, Jacqueline. I guess a question for you.
Yeah.
How do you feel? I guess it's let me try to phrase this in an eloquent way.
You can do it in a non-eloquent way.
Yeah, I'll understand. It's okay. I have the practice.
Very aggressive and non-eloquent way. How about that? Let's.
Yeah.
So, because once again, you're at an age bracket that is firmly in the lower end of, I guess, the spectrum of collectors out there. And correct me if I'm making a wrong assumption here, but I think it's reasonably on target.
What, my age?
Yeah, right.
I'm actually 35.
Are you?
I am a middle-aged European man.
Spinster. She's a spinster.
Once
divorced.
I see. All the filters, man.
Once,
it's really hard to gauge with, But so how do you see, so I guess I want to hear about your experience of interacting with various age brackets, right? Of collectors that are out there. And
good question.
Yeah, from your perspective, from your age bracket, right? When you interact with people from your sort of similar age bracket, with maybe people from like 30s to 40s to people from maybe higher up in the age bracket, like what are some interesting observations that from the lens of a younger crowd, right? What are some interesting observations you could offer us?
Oh yeah, very interesting, because I was just talking about this the other day. It's not a very positive answer though, but it's honest, so I'm gonna say it. Okay, when I created my account, I was kind of pushed into it by a friend of mine, because my focus was on photography at the time, and I wanted to combine two into one-on-one together. So and then it quickly became I started using this account to reach out to people, because as you get more and more into it, it seemed almost unprofessional to reach out to watch people through like a private account, right? People don't really know who you are. So I wanted to start an account based on convenience. And at the beginning, the people that I reached out to were all most of them were much older than me and much more seasoned and experienced, and I took it as a very cherished and valuable learning opportunity. Just it's like a swamp of information that you're just swimming in. And then as I progressed, it kind of became the position shifted a little, where I feel more confident in myself in conversing this topic, because I have been learning, and while I still view them as like a mentor figure, um, it's just I still, you know, remind myself just how young I am, and I need to be confident and step out of my comfort zone to talk to these people. And I think I have gotten better at it. But recently, I've started to notice, right, that okay, so that's like before, that's like when I first started and reaching out for knowledge per se. But then recently, you know, I've had my account for about 2 years now, and I've also met a lot of young people on Instagram, so around the same age as I am. And it is very different talking to the younger crowd, because there's not that sense of the age barrier, and you speak more freely and in a more carefree manner. I mean, it's more comfortable. And most of the time, it's not about watches, right? You could be talking about lifestyle or sneakers or trading aspects. But that point aside, the not so positive part that I brought up at the beginning is I have started to realize that people don't really take me as seriously. If you don't know my back, like if we don't know each other that well, and people don't take me as seriously as someone who knows who I am and knows about my age, but you know, have spoken and spent time conversing with me. So what does that say? That says, you know, given the face value, someone who is young in their early 20s, I don't want to talk about gender, but it does have to, you know, have a role in this, I believe. I don't think gets taken seriously most of the time. And it's not just, you know, asking about stuff. It's like like a range of things, right? Like sometimes I would reach out and then they would never even reply, or I respond and then all of a sudden, like out of nowhere, just dead end, like no replies, no responses. Or when I go, like, it's gonna sound bad, but even when I went to, you know, Geneva for a little bit and I was making appointments, I was getting pushed to accommodate other people because I was alone, I was young, and maybe because I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I can only speculate here. And it didn't make sense to me until I kind of brought it up with another collector who's from Monaco, and he's the same age as me. And we're just talking about it. And then it ended up a lot of the experiences that we've had. He also doesn't think he gets taken seriously because of his age. And then it just kind of became this topic that we were talking about in a group chat. A lot of young collectors started speaking up and was like, yeah, no, like you thought that was just yourself? No. It totally happens to me as well. Whenever I walk into a boutique or whatever, make an appointment, people don't show me the things because of my age. They think that I don't know what I'm talking about. And then the next day I come with like older collector that I know and call a friend. Suddenly there's a whole tray of watches we can try on. I've never had that experience because I haven't really walked into many boutiques or ADs, but it is an experience that resonated with a lot of people. So to end on a positive note, I think I can see why the age is somewhat of a the age factor is used as a very face value judgment on the person, right? Because it is what you notice about another person when you first meet them, right? You notice how they look, their facial structures, and their age, right? Are they a student? Are they working? And that is a part of how you judge a stranger when you first see them. And it's not something that I complain about because I think it's just normal day-to-day life. Like it is how we use to, it is one of the factors that we use to judge the other person or get to know the other person. I just wish that, and it's not going to work because, you know, it's all biological at this point. So I can only, you know, dress more maturely and people take me more seriously. But I do wish that, you know, brands or whatever, if you're hearing this, if a young kid like were to go on a solo trip and make some appointments to see some watches that she really cares about, don't push her to accommodate other groups of more experienced collectors or older collectors. Because while I do understand, like, yeah, they might have more purchasing power and they're a group and, you know, it's more people, it does hurt. And yeah, but again, I understand. Like I'm a really easy person. I don't hold grudges. It's just it does disappoint me a little bit, and I wish it
How is
won't
that a positive
happen
note?
as often. I think
Okay,
it's
on a
positive
positive
because
note, you should enjoy this because the three of us were like, hey, please don't take us so seriously.
It's true. It's true. It's people say, it's people they come up to you and say, is that voice? No, you got it mixed up. No.
But
Yeah.
that's interesting to hear. I mean, but there's a bit of a paradigm shift, I think. I think what we discussed earlier with the sort of the new wave of younger collectors coming into the scene, and I've met plenty of really young people with, you know, sort of unparalleled levels of passion and knowledge. And sort of platforms like Instagram is so fascinating because you could be faceless. Nobody would know who your age. They would just judge you based on the information that you end up posting, or, you know, the pictures that you take and so forth.
Yeah.
So you have a much more of a neutral sort of a baseline to be judged on upon, right? But in person, I mean, you know, I guess watches were always a symbol of the whole marketing revolved around how much have you achieved in your life so far, and, you know, age just happens to have a very linear correlation with, you know, how much you've achieved. So, you know, at least in the past anyway. And once again, that whole aspect is another discussion for another day, and, you know, there's whole different, you know, multiple sort of angles to sort of talking about this, but you know, those are all very old paradigms, right? I think
but they're a paradigm for a reason, right? Like we're so used to using them and being a part of our lives. So I guess a positive note that I did want that I mentioned before is I understand it. I don't hold a grudge. I just wish that you know, people took us a little bit more seriously, and which, you know, again, this is face value, right? After you get to know the person, then they're like, oh, you actually know your stuff, right? But then when you first meet them, of course, we make certain speculations face value. So that's
Very interesting point. Very interesting point, considering a lot of brands want to target young generation. The young generation then comes and they don't take care of them.
Exactly, right.
Like, doesn't make sense. And then also, you know, the marketing around watches is still very like, oh my God, like how old is that now? Still going about like success and yeah, like at middle-aged 35-year-old, you know, if you look at all the poster campaigns, it's that image, right? Like you say you want to target the younger generation, like literally, did you just expect them to walk in? Like, you know?
Right, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Okay, so we're moving on to the last bit here, which is the quick fire. We have 10 questions. Are you ready?
Okay, all right. And short answers, I'm assuming then.
Yeah. Short answers. Short answers.
Okay.
Your favorite go-to vacation spot?
You guys, you really have to rub it in, huh? You think I take vacations? Last year when I took a vacation, I stayed home and watched and changed my kids' diapers.
Can I just say you're fooling?
I mean, really. I mean, this is so out of line for me. Like, why are you doing this to me? Like, it's actually a very difficult question for me because it's been a long time since I've ever had a real vacation. But
I know what D is going to say. He's going to say the toilet. Toilet office.
That's my daily vacation time. I mean, that's as much as I get. I mean, you nailed it. But I really like Honolulu. I go there for business a lot. We have clients there, and I end up using that as, so I just, from familiarity, you know, it just became like a second home. That unfortunately I haven't been a chance to go the past couple of years, but you know, I go there once or twice a year from New York, and we just made a lot of good memories there. I just feel comfortable. I don't have to worry about anything. You know, just like I know where things are. I know where all the good, you know, spots are. You know, I know what food to get, and you know.
Hey, what are you talking about? You're going on vacation next week.
Yeah, first time ever. Like, this is like, I've never been to the Keys before. I mean, it's just, you know, so you have no idea how stressed out we are right now. We are super stressed out. This is like my wife and I are paralyzed at this point. Like,
because of the kids?
No, yeah, just because of the trip. It's not a vacation for us anymore. I mean, just wait until you have 2 little kids, okay? And you know, it's you.
Okay. I will rub it in.
Yeah,
I
I would say Honolulu is kind of one of our favorites.
Okay.
Just because, you know, familiarity and all that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Next question. What watch are you gonna take to the Keys?
I will take the G-Shock and AP offshore, the titanium offshore that I recently posted. Maybe a yellow gold Rolex GMT. That also happens to be my birth year watch. I always think that kind of yellow gold, all gold sort of, you know,
very
dial look is a very cool look on the beach for some reason, but that's just me and my mental image, you know. Good news is I'm going to a place where there aren't that many other people around, so I could enjoy me and my self-image a lot. So, you know.
Noted. Okay. What will be your children's first watch?
I already got my first kid a little Swatch, one of those flick black watches. He really likes cars, so there was one with a, you know, a fire engine theme on the watch. He does not like wearing it.
Has to grow into it.
He hasn't grown into. So you know, that's a good. I mean, once again, I all I know is that I don't want to force it on them, right? Because that's the thing I actually worry the most. Is my passion going to get in the way of them ever enjoying watches the way I'm able to enjoy watches, right? Like as I discussed early on, one of the reasons why I'm able to enjoy watches now at this age, you know, point where I'm at right now is precisely because I've had zero exposure to this, you know, all throughout the first, say, 30 years of my life. You know, and you know, if my kids think that, like, you know, seeing these cool watches around, you know, and watch books everywhere in the house is kind of, and they get desensitized to it, right? It's not so special anymore to them. They might still love them, but certainly it ain't going to be, you know, something so special where it's like they made the discovery. It loses a bit of the personal touch. So maybe they got to go find their own thing, you know. But we'll see. You know.
Yeah, for sure. Watches or cars?
It's a tough one. It's
you had to pick one.
I've had a lot of wrestling over this.
Yep.
And like honestly, this has been a very, very difficult question for me personally, because cars I can enjoy with my family, and make memories together, and watches is just a very personal journey, right? I've leaned much more heavily towards cars for that reason recently, because I could take I've already made some really wonderful memories with my kids, you know, in my car together, you know, going on road trips. You know, watches can't do that, right? But also there's something more ephemeral about cars, right? You wreck a car, it's done. You know, it's not like watches where, I mean, watches, yes, I mean, if somebody steals it or you break it, it's gone too, but it's repairable, right? If you break it. And there's something more there's a sense of permanence to watches that doesn't exist with cars. Cars are consumable at the end of the day. So I think from that perspective, I have to say watches, because they feel like they feel more permanent.
Permanent as in like something you could pass on?
Perhaps that's a big element of that, right? Something that feels like it will outlive sort of me. I mean, obviously, many of the classic cars that we see today would have outlived me if we were born in the same age, the same time as the cars were born.
Yep.
But so clearly there are ways to make it work. But in general, generally speaking, like it's cars feel like outside of a very few select examples. But once again, those cars. Once you get into those collector cars, you can't drive them to the supermarket, with your kids either. That's kind of it's a difficult. Watches, I think, still watches for me.
I got a follow-on question from that. I don't know if it can take up another question of yours, Jack, but
yeah, sure.
How important has your watch journey been to your own personal journey, your personal development? Because you mentioned, your kids having to find their own thing. But what has watches given you? You obviously you work very hard, but how has watches helped you self-develop?
I think people, once again, I've been able to connect and meet and form friendships with people of all age brackets, all different industries, all different backgrounds, people I would have never expected to meet, let alone become close friends with, if it wasn't for watches. I can't think of something that has single-handedly transformed sort of my personal growth from that perspective. It's truly, I mean, like many of these people that I consider close friends are, if it wasn't for watches, I would have never met these people.
Yep, for sure. Difficult question, maybe for you. Like, what one brand that you think is doing everything right at this point?
G-Shock is that the No, that's a good question. Geez,
We could come back to it if you want.
One brand, huh?
Yeah.
That's doing everything right.
Maybe not everything, but then that is doing it right in your eyes.
This is gonna sound very cliche, but I think you gotta give it to Patek Philippe for, I think, overall doing things right. I'm not saying that it's an A+ job all around, but compared to the rest of the scene, I think they still kind of do it the right way. And yes, I mean, we could talk on and on about this whole Tiffany, Nautilus thing and how they've sold out and all that, and where does the future hold and so forth. But in the grand scheme of things, I think they probably do things the best.
What's your opinion on the Tiffany Nautilus? I've never seen you discuss it. Because people were very passionate on Instagram when that came out.
I mean, it's a genius move, really, actually. The way that family has sort of flexed its marketing muscle, right? I mean, they know what they're doing. This piece has a very, very well-defined purpose, which is to continue to build a hype around the brand, turn Tiffany & Co. from a middle segment jewelry shop that was, kind of, doing so, stuck in malls and so forth, to vault it up to the top of the tier, jewelry brand, right? That amongst the young generation, and this selective process of the way they have sort of very carefully, right? None of this is ever a mistake in terms of how pieces got shown, when pieces got shown, by whom. I mean, expect more of this to come, right? Obviously, given the number of pieces that are out there, but it is an absolutely a genius move from a marketing perspective. I think once again, it was LVMH and Tiffany, leading the show. Patek had really very little to do with it, I would say. Other than just tag along, but fantastic move on their part. Do I like it? I mean, look, if I got one, I would certainly wear it. I have no issues with it. I don't think it's ugly. I mean, it's what it is. It's not. But also I'm very realistic in that it's not a piece that regular people are not ever going to get to wear, right? It's just not. It's just not that piece.
Mm-hmm.
And but yeah, I mean, it had a very well-defined purpose, and it's accomplished it very well. I think that's where it stands for me.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't really it doesn't really stir up any more of an emotional response than, you know, like a slow clap, well done type of a, you know, response.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. On the marketing or on the watch?
On the marketing, the watch is what it is. The watch is, you know, what new thing does the watch bring, right? I mean, it doesn't. There's nothing, you know, there's nothing, you know, poor about, you know, with the watch. It's just a different color dial, right? It's just ultimately the whole setup and the marketing. I mean, they've really taken this to a whole new level that I don't think any watch brand has done anything like this ever before.
Mm.
You know,
Great.
at this scale and at this sort of ambition.
Mm-hmm.
You know, of bringing all the celebrities from all sorts of, you know, whether it's fashion, music, you know, sports. It's wow. I'm it's very impressive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very coordinated effort. Very impressive.
Mm-hmm. A follow-up to my previous question, which is one brand that you think could be doing better.
Oh,
So like they have the fundamentals, but aren't making proper choices in your eyes, or yeah, could be doing better in general.
well, Vasher. I mean, like, I'm just going to talk about the sort of, you know, the, I guess, the big three, or
Mhm.
let's just stick with the Holy Trinity, or, you know, if, just for the ease of argument, because I think, you know, this would turn into another whole, you know, session over a full day's worth of talk if we want to talk about how every single brand can improve. Because you know, I think we're more disappointed than pleased with many of the brands out there, right? Generally speaking, because it's easy to criticize a customer anyway. But like, I mean, Vacheron could start by making decent looking watches. I think that's a good start.
Gosh.
I mean, I'm not asking for much here, right? Just one simple answer. I mean, overseas is, you know, starting to get some hype. And look, I mean, they've done a great job trying to revive that. And the latest line of the ultra thin overseas models are absolutely stunning. I think it's getting some really good recognition. But you know, they need a solid, like, you know, few back-to-back home runs, I think, in terms of design and desirability of watches. AP, I think they've taken sort of, it's sort of like they wanted to do what Tiffany / Patek has done, but really kind of had a B+ execution, I feel, and pissed off way more people in the process than they, you know, probably should have. Is the feeling I'm getting. I mean, you know, I wasn't any sort of directly involved in any sort of, you know, issue with AP other than sort of the usual sort of attitudes, you know, that you get at, you know, walking into boutiques, like, you know, looking like a bum. But you know, once again, you know, what is their brand, if it wasn't for the Royal Oak, right? And like, how do they make this into a sustainable franchise past the Royal Oak? Especially if they're losing existing, you know, loyalty from existing customers, you know, at this kind of a pace. It just seems like their strategies feel very short-sighted. And while they may be vastly successful in the current sort of environment, and bringing in a lot of sort of newcomers into the field and so forth. Once again, I'm making very broad strokes of judgment here, but it seems like they could use you know, a slightly more what's the right word here? A little better of an approach, you know, for lack of any, you know, more refined word there. And of course, I think you know, coming up with it's hard, right? I mean, what do you do after the Royal Oak when your entire brand right now is essentially, despite all the wonderful things they've done in the past, and you know, things that they should get credit for now, even within the Code series, right? I mean, there are watches that do deserve attention, but it's just difficult to live under the shadows forever of the Royal Oak. At least Patek Philippe has other crazy grand complications and, you know, other cool things that are happening on a regular basis. And what does AP have, right? It's much harder to sort of formulate that answer. So I don't know. You know, as for everybody else, I mean, you know, it's just you know, a collector has his views, but once again, unclear how relevant that is.
I'm
But I'm
really
sure there's a
interested.
comment. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I was gonna say I'm really interested to see what AP does in 2023.
Yeah,
Like after this whole 50th anniversary,
yeah.
because I mean it's going to be all Royal Oaks for this year, for the upcoming year, and see what they come up with in 2023. So
I've heard a lot of positive responses about how AP did their rollout of the 50th anniversary pieces. You know, it seems like that was reasonably well received. I mean, look, I mean, the actual level of excitement that I had over the pieces is a separate issue altogether, right? But just the media rollout and so forth, I think, you know, people seem to be reasonably okay with. But we'll see. I mean, they got to get pieces in, you know, people's hands who are willing to pay the money for it, and without reducing the hype, because once that hype starts to go down, it's a one-way train, unfortunately, for all these brands, right? So it's a tough thing to balance. How do you maintain that hype and continue to sort of, you know, build on that brand equity while without killing off the base, right? You can't, you know, there's only so much choking you can do, you know, before you kill the person.
Okay, last two questions. One piece of advice for someone who is looking to get started, and let me clarify advice. Like, I think right now with all this buzz going on, it's very easy for someone who's not experienced to get lost. So what would you say or suggest to someone who's like a newbie, and that could clear it up a little bit for them? So cancel out a little bit of the noise.
I mean, the easy answer is buy what you love, right? I think it's so easy to take ourselves very seriously, even for newcomers nowadays, with sort of all the information and hype that's surrounding here. I think we just got to take a step back and go back to the fundamentals of why we're buying watches. It's got to make you feel good, right? People, you know, watches have always been something to express our identity, express our sort of character, right? And I think that we should not forget about that. You know, we still use watches for whatever reason, however we use it, ultimately is an expression of our self-identity, right? And a reaffirmation of it in many ways, right? It's a process that goes together. And I think people, you know, so many people who have never thought about watches or talked about watches in the past are just learning about watches, and the only thing they can think of is, you know, what the market has done in the past and which has the most, you know, highest investment potential. And I think that's absolutely the wrong. That's just the, you know, highway to, you know, disappointment, I feel. So yeah, I mean, I think we just have to, once again, we can't ignore the financial aspects of it, but I think it would be very important for all newcomers to really think about, you know, just go back to the basics. What do you want to wear? What would you love to wear, right? What makes you feel good? You know, what makes you smile when you look at your wrist with the watch on? I think those are really some key aspects.
And last but not least, your next piece, do you have anything planned in mind, or anything that you're looking to acquire down the road?
There was
What are you thinking about? What are you thinking about at night? Yeah.
I mean, there was a piece that I got very close to acquiring, and you know, you and I have discussed this. That fell through, but you know, once again, I'm sort of, you know, whatever. If it comes through, it comes through. It could take. I mean, I'm being patient with these things. But right now, a very exciting thing is I've committed to a project from an independent watchmaker whose name is still sort of all under embargo. There, as mentioned earlier, there are so many wonderful independents and, you know, watchmaking projects that have sort of sprouted up in the past couple of years. And I think they're all wonderful, but for the first time in a while, I think I found something that really sort of that resonated with me. And so, you know, I think, you know, if we're lucky, 2024, maybe, you know, maybe two, three, you know, maybe 4 years, depending where I'm willing to be patient with the progress. I know good things take time and there will be delays inevitably. But you know, I'm very excited about that. And this was a very recent development. The commitment and sort of the finalization was sort of, you know, a very recent development. And hopefully, you know, as time progresses, I'll be able to share more with you guys. But that is a very exciting project. I'm very happy and proud to be involved in sort of essentially funding a new venture. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Dee. I know it's super late for you, so thank you for hanging out with us for better half of
Yeah, thank
hour.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you guys. I mean, this is a big honor for me. And look, I mean, it's wonderful to meet you guys, and hopefully we could all sort of meet in person down the line and hang out and talk watches and other things.
We took your podcast virginity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now I am a free man.
Yeah. And
Really
even though
go
you
out
look
and
so young, we
do all
take
the
you
podcasting.
seriously.
Okay, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you on the next one.
All right,
Bye-bye.
thanks all.
Bye.
As always, thank you for listening to the Waiting List podcast.
We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. And if you have any questions,
Comments.
Or feedback.
feel free to reach out to us at the Waiting List Podcast on Instagram or via our private accounts.
We'll see you on the next one.
Bye.
Bye.